Hello, this is Aware on the Air, brought to you weekly by friends and members of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. I'm Ron Zook. My fellow panelists tonight are on my right, Deb Johnson. On my left, Janet Guthrie, the pastor of the local Mennonite church, who we'll hear from later. On her left, Karen Aram, and on her left, the usual anchor on this show, Carl Estabrook, who's just returned from a trip to China and perhaps some other countries, and we'll have something more to say about that along the lines of what I did on my summer vacation.
Exactly.
So, okay, I wanted to begin with some notes on events of the past week. The operation of the national security state has resulted in the indictment of reporter James Risen, who refused to identify a confidential source. That has gone to the Supreme Court, and now Mr. Risen, a New York Times reporter, is in danger of being indicted and imprisoned because he did not reveal his confidential source for some of his the stories in his writings of a few years ago. President Obama gave an address to the graduating class at West Point, and the main point of which seemed to be, to me, that other countries had damn well better submit to American leadership, whatever that means. And he made some vague noises about how they will be punished if they remain recalcitrant. Apparently we're going to isolate them and let them know that they are indeed ringed with American military bases, so they had better reconsider their ways. A lot of stories have been appearing in the past few days about the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square shootings in China, and perhaps Karen and Carl will have something more to say about that later. And we're getting, as usual in the American media, an extremely one-sided picture of that. Today, President Obama is in Warsaw, and we're told that he has pledged solidarity with Eastern Europe, so he's left markers again in another place saying that we will come to their defense. So this puts us in a position of having to fight another war in Eastern Europe, apparently, if the Russians or other bad guys attack Poland or any other NATO America. So we are pledged to the defense not only of Israel, Japan, the Philippines, but of course all NATO countries. And every marker laid down in this respect, I think, makes ultimately war more probable. And I don't know how we're going to get over that. He has promised the Poles a $1 billion fund for increasing military deployments in Europe. So we're supposed to be going in the other direction, remember, and cutting expenditures and military buildup, but that's what's happening. We're told in another article in Reuters that NATO is to consider longer-term responses to the Ukraine crisis, so there's more war planning going on. And in another story, the New York Times, May 30th, the U.S. sway in Asia is imperiled as China challenges alliances. So the picture they're trying to present is that China is challenging our dominance and ultimate control over all of the Pacific Basin. And China is challenging that, and we're going to step up and meet the challenge. So there are a lot of threads there that deserve some comment. But our first order of business is to talk about one of the historic peace churches that have tried to bear witness to the Christian witness against war, fighting, and militarism. Traditionally, there have been at least three of those: the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Brethren. And we're fortunate to have with us today Pastor Janet Guthrie of the local Mennonite church, and I've asked her to say a few words about the historic relationship of the Mennonite church to peace advocacy, and then something about her own views on the matter, and something about her congregation as well, if she has time for that. So, Janet.
Thank you, Ron, very much. I'm delighted to be here with you all today and to share a bit from our tradition and our local witness. The Mennonite Church began in the early 1500s. 1525 is when we sort of date our beginnings, and this is the time of the radical shift known as the Reformation in Europe, when the Catholic Church found itself challenged by other Christians who wished to suggest that there were other ways to practice church and to be faithful. And many of us have heard about Martin Luther or John Calvin, other reformers. The branch that the Mennonites are descended from, the Anabaptists, were a smaller wave of reformers beginning, as I said, in 1525. And they really established what we now call the free church tradition, in the sense of a church that would be free from the control and the intertwining of church and state. So the Anabaptists took a different stance from Luther and Calvin in saying that baptism was something that belonged to the believers' community, not something that needed to be brought into the sphere of citizenship or the control of the state. So this put them at odds with authorities right from the beginning. And there was then an immediate pushback in terms of persecution and what became a great deal of martyrdom. There is, in fact, an important document called the Martyr's Mirror, which recounts the stories of many early Anabaptists who died rather than renounce their beliefs, and certainly rather than take up the sword.
Anabaptist means baptizing again, right?
It does mean baptizing again, and thank you for asking me that. And the reason is not that we today are baptizing multiple times, but that at the time of this radical Reformation, all infants who were deemed to be, at that point, members then of this community governed by the state in Europe were baptized as infants. And the early Anabaptists said, we want to have this be a choice, that you choose to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and that you need to be, in our opinion, of a discerning age to understand what is involved, because it's a weighty decision. Jesus calls us to a way of life that is very disciplined, and that includes things like loving our enemies. Well, that's not something that you can take lightly. And so the idea that this would be a free choice and that this would form its own community of people who were dedicated to a life of peace and service was important. So that's the early story, and it meant that Anabaptists did not take positions, certainly in those early centuries, associated with the government. They did not go into the military. They looked back to the very earliest Christians from those first centuries, when Christians renounced service in the military and found themselves very much committed to Jesus's words from the Gospels, which are a call to peace and peacemaking. So that's the early Anabaptist witness. There's a story, perhaps the most iconic story from the Mennonites, and it relates to a person named Dirk Willems, who was a Dutchman, and who was had been imprisoned and managed to escape. this prison, and he is making his way across a frozen lake. It's the middle of winter. It's very treacherous. And he is about to burst into freedom when the prison guard is following him across the ice and falls through the ice, as the story goes, and this has been documented historically. And Dirk realizes what has happened and feels called upon in a humanitarian way to return and actually pull his captor, his previous captor, from the ice and save his life. As a result, Dirk is returned to prison and eventually executed. So this is the kind of story that calls out, our most unselfish behavior, which is to say that we would in fact go so far as to save the life of, quote, an enemy rather than privilege our own life. Anabaptists became there were multiple strands of Anabaptism. One is the Amish, with whom we have sort of a distant kind of cousin relationship. We practice in different ways now. We, of course, in the Mennonite Church are prepared to embrace higher learning, life in the modern world, although we're committed to a life of simplicity. Let me say maybe a little bit about my own personal journey to the Mennonite Church. I did not grow up Mennonite, and that is a departure from some of the ways in which the Mennonites, because they were a persecuted and oftentimes rural-based people, kind of had life more unto themselves. But particularly in the last century so, the call of the peace churches, like the Mennonites, has been heard broadly among people who want to have an opportunity to practice what they believe is in fact the gospel of peace. And so I am one of those people who grew up in a time when I was affected as a college student here at the University of Illinois by the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, had been dedicated to peacemaking, but hadn't really found the right intersection of that with my religious views. And along the way, as someone who worked in higher education, and particularly with international education and affairs, I ran into the Mennonites and became very, very impressed with the way in which they accompanied people globally in a compassionate response as peacemakers, and the Mennonites I met who really walked the talk. So I chose to join the Mennonite Church and eventually to become a pastor. And it has been a great privilege indeed. I wore today one of my favorite sort of personal mementos. I have traveled widely throughout the world, and I'm wearing today a bracelet which I acquired in the country of Namibia in sub-Saharan Africa. It is made of a discarded artillery shell. Which was found by the nomadic people called the Ovahimba people on the border to Angola, where there was much fighting, freedom fighting. And the Ovahimba people took and took the shell and carved it, if you will, into strips and then put a wonderful decoration on it. So this is this is an example I like to wear of the biblical phrase of swords into plowshares, or in this case, artillery shells into a beautiful object. At church these days, we are asking, our children are collecting an offering for an organization called Raw Tools. And Raw, R-A-W, is war spelled backwards, of course. And Raw Tools is an organization that collects guns and melts them down and makes them into gardening implements and other implements. So again, it's a way of acting out and demonstrating this movement that we would like to see become universal, that we would be people of peace.
Do you have young people considering entering the military, and how do you counsel them if they do?
We do have, of course, like, like all young people today, there's much attention given to how do I get a job, how do I finance my education, and the military does offer some very attractive benefits, as you know. So we do in our youth education classes talk about our peace stance. We offer an opportunity for them to receive counseling, to establish a file at church, documenting their beliefs, and so that if they were called upon to declare CO status, they could. And of course, that becomes more pressing if there would be a reinstitution of the draft or some such thing. And there also is a scholarship opportunity through the larger church if a young person finds themselves very motivated in terms of what it would take for them to go to school or whatever. So we do attempt to be cognizant of that and of the witness we would like to bring for them. We have routinely asked some of our members who can talk about their own service during the Second World War, for example, in alternative service, to tell their stories, and others who have done global peacemaking service to speak with our youth about their witness, and that has been important. I want to say two other things about our congregation. I know my time is about up, but we have made a specific witness in establishing a relationship with a church in Colombia, which of course has one of the longest running conflicts, internal conflicts in our time. Many displaced people, many concerns. And we have been inspired by the witness of our sister church, and we've been able to also provide them with some assistance as they minister to displaced people in that very strife-torn country. And secondly, we established a peace garden with our neighbors at the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center. And we have been working in an interfaith way to provide a witness. So if you drive along Springfield Avenue here in Urbana, you will see a sign that says Muslims and Mennonites planting peace a seed at a time. And there is also a peace garden now at the mosque. So these are, that is a symbolic action, but one that has been very meaningful for us. Yeah. So thank you for asking me to share.
One of the biggest issues in early Christianity, first, second, third centuries, was whether Christians could be soldiers or participate in the military, right?
Correct.
And that got resolved in various ways, but does it hurt you to be called, well, not a pacifist because you accepted that, but for Mennonites to be called cowards because they refused to fight?
You know, there was a lot of concern, especially I think the First World War was a very difficult time for European immigrants, many of whom still retained some language and other connections to Europe. Many spoke German or whatever, and so they were very quickly cast as cowards and traitors. Many went to prison and so on. That was less a problem in the Second World War because there was a mode for alternative service where people took some great risks actually in their alternative service, working in mental hospitals and also providing different kinds of medical care and so on. So that was helpful. But I think there still is a way in which we sometimes, our loyalties are questioned, our allegiance are questioned, questions about military service, service in the police, in government organizations, payment of taxes that go directly toward the war effort. These are all matters that people have to wrestle with.
Yes.
And they wrestle with individually, some in different ways, and we wrestle with as a community. And I'm just grateful that some of these, they're not easy questions because we benefit from a society, we benefit from social services, we want to pray for our government officials, we care about the common weal, but we also know that our ultimate authority is placed elsewhere. So I'm grateful that we can be a community to wrestle with those issues and that we can do it also with folks who may not affiliate with us in terms of our religious views, but share some other common values, and that we can work together in that way.
Very good, Janet. Questions or comments from other panel members.
I have a comment and a question. My comment first is that I have worked with Mennonites in Asia.
Yes.
That were helping Burmese exiles.
Yes.
And I was very impressed with them, with their work. My question would be, do you have any members of your church, shall we say, under arrest or jailed or in any way being persecuted by any government anywhere in the world, and that includes the U.S., for any of their activities? I say this in reference to Kathy Kelly, who
Right.
is not a Mennonite, I don't
No,
believe,
but
I know she has.
Certainly,
How
yeah.
is that?
Well, there certainly are folks who have been jailed because of their witness in terms of protesting various things, a nonviolent protest.
Right,
We certainly
right.
have seen that here in this country. Currently, I think the biggest risk for Mennonites globally are in places like Vietnam, and there have been some other Asian countries too, where just the establishment of the church and their capacity to operate has been challenged. So I mentioned Vietnam just because I saw some recent reports from there. But that certainly does happen.
What about Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria?
Well, there have been, Mennonites have been in Iran, particularly up in the north. There was some very friendly connections made through the seminary there and through Mennonites both in Canada and the U.S. Not everyone looked kindly on that. To my knowledge, there have been no arrests or anything associated with that. And there have been some people who have been on the front lines who've been killed, but that because they were in a volatile situation like Afghanistan within recent, but that they were not there as military, but they were there in other ways. Yeah.
Further questions or comments? Deb, and
Well,
then
I
Carl.
think the garden is a wonderful thing, and I hope I get a chance to see it.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I would love to see it.
Good. Thanks.
Carl?
I was at a church service in Beijing last week, which was led by a Canadian evangelical, and the congregation was made up primarily of Africans, local Beijingers, and Canadians. And it was a strange mix, and the political questions obtruded right away. We asked the pastor whether he was permitted to do this, basically, by the Chinese government. And he responded with the sort of proverbs that we heard throughout China. He said their approach is one eye open, one eye closed. That is, there's no official approval, but on the other hand, there's no attempt to stop them from carrying on as they were. And the reason for this is that they worry about political actions through this group.
Sure.
The Chinese government could care less about what this group met together on Sunday to do, except for the fact that it would become a point of political opposition.
Right.
And in some sense, it seems to me that the history of Mennonites vis-a-vis the United States has a certain similarity.
Right, right. Yes,
Depends on how political you are.
That's right. And there was a time when Mennonites were known as the quiet in the land. I think with that history of persecution and so on, a sense of kind of retreating. In more recent decades, there has been a greater willingness to be involved in efforts to lobby and to protest openly and so on. But that has not been without controversy. It did represent a kind of sea change. And I think the number of us in the church who have come from other backgrounds, the movement into more of a city, more urban environment, more Mennonites with higher education, more global involvement has naturally brought about that stance. But it's a very good observation, Carl. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Let's see, who's next, Karen?
Me.
Oh, Karen, okay.
Yeah. I was I just want to mention that last week when I read that Pepe Escobar had written, I'm not going to reread it, but it did fit in very well with some of what you were talking about earlier, Ron, and that has to do with the U.S. military buildup. So maybe we need to reaffirm that another time. But I'm going to read from what Pepe Escobar wrote more recently. And also, this all revolves around the Eurasian century, as he calls it. There is also information here which I had planned on discussing related to what Pepe refers to as the exit the petrodollar, enter the gaso yuan, meaning the Chinese RMB or yuan, as they call it. And it relates to how will Russia be paying, or how will China be paying Russia for their gas? Will they be using the US dollar, or will they be using the Chinese yuan? And this becomes quite important in the future, because we're also talking about changing of financial instruments, what the impact will be in the future, but I think we'll wait on that until another time. So what I want to talk about here is Pepe's pointing out that in more ways than one, and I apologize for my voice, but I also apologize I have to read this, because I can't possibly do Pepe well unless I read what he actually has to say. In more ways than one, last week heralded the birth of a Eurasian century. Of course, the U.S. $400 billion Russia-China gas deal was clinched only at the last minute in Shanghai on Wednesday, but it complemented the $270 billion oil deal between Rosneft and China's CNPC. Then on Thursday, most of the main players were at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Russian answer to Davos. And on Friday, Russian President Vladimir Putin, fresh from his Shanghai triumph, addressed the participants and brought the house down. He goes on to say that as Chinese Vice President Li Wanchao, that's the Vice President, describes it, we plan to combine the program for the development of Russia's Far East and the strategy for the development of Northeast China into an integrated concept. The pushed in Ukraine, and I say pushed by P-U-T-S-C-H, part of Washington's pivot to contain Russia, just served to accelerate Russia's pivot to Asia, which sooner or later would become inevitable. The Chinese New Silk Roads, whose ultimate aim is to unite, by way of trade and commerce, no less than China, Russia, and Germany. For Washington, this is beyond anathema. The response has been to peddle a couple of deals which, in thesis, would guarantee American monopoly of 2/3 of global commerce. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which was essentially rebuked by key Asians, such as Japan and Malaysia, during Obama's trip, and the even more problematic Transatlantic Partnership with the EU, which average Europeans absolutely abhor. Both deals are being negotiated in secret and are profitable essentially for U.S. multinational corporations. For Asia, China instead proposes a free trade area of Asia-Pacific. After all, it is already the largest trading partner of the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, known as ASEAN. And for Europe, Beijing proposes an extension of the railway that in only 12 days links Chengdu, that's the capital of Sichuan, to Lodz in Poland, crossing Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus. The total deal is the Chongqing-Xinjiang Europe network, with a final stop in Duisburg, Germany. There's more.
Yeah.
One day before the clinching of the Russia-China gas deal, President Xi Jinping called for no less than a new Asian security cooperation architecture, including, of course, Russia and Iran, and excluding the U.S. Somehow echoing Putin, Xi described NATO as a Cold War relic. And guess who was at the announcement in Shanghai, apart from the Central Asian stands? Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, Afghan President Hamid Karzai, and crucially, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. The facts on the ground speak for themselves. China is buying at least half of Iraq's oil production and is investing heavily in its energy infrastructure. China has invested heavily in Afghanistan's mining industry, especially lithium and cobalt. And obviously, both China and Russia keep doing business in Iran. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, known as SCO, okay, they are gearing up to become something way beyond a sort of counterpart to NATO. NATO focuses mostly on terrorism and fighting drug trafficking. The SCO wants to do major business. Iran, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Mongolia are observers, and sooner rather than later will be accepted as full members. Once again, that's Eurasian integration in action. The branching out of the new Silk Roads is inevitable, and that spells out a practice closer integration with Afghanistan minerals and Iran energy. The now symbiotic China-Russia strategic alliance, with the possibility of extending towards Iran, is the fundamental fact on the ground in the young 21st century. It will extrapolate across the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and the non-aligned movement. There is much more to this. There are far more details, but I will leave that to another time when more of us can be involved in the discussion on that, the details. I have one more thing I want to say.
Sure, do it.
It's not related to China. I think it was a couple weeks ago, Deb, you brought up you talked about the International Criminal Court and some of the actions that were taking place related to what took place in KL, Malaysia, or Kuala Lumpur. And Karen then mentioned the Professor Francis Boyle, the legal professor from the University of Illinois here in Champaign, and we had some discussions on the International Criminal Court. Well, and I think Stuart even mentioned something. Well, here's the latest now, and I think it's important to note this. The World Court is to target the UK for war crimes in Iraq. They have announced a preliminary investigation into allegations of atrocities involving systematic detainee abuse. Now, this is written by Sarah Lazar, a staff writer with Common Dreams. 11 years after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, not a single high-level official has been held accountable for the numerous war crimes perpetrated throughout the war. Yet a Tuesday announcement that the International Criminal Court is reopening a preliminary investigation into charges that British troops systematically perpetrated atrocities in Iraq raised the faint possibility that this could change. The ICC prosecutor came to the decision after being presented with new evidence alleging the responsibility of officials of the United Kingdom for war crimes involving systematic detainee abuse in Iraq from 2003 until 2008. Now, in 2006, then ICC prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo, he turned down an investigation into the UK abuses in Iraq after determining the acts did not have sufficient gravity, citing a supposed lack of victims among other factors. Yet new evidence presented by Germany-based human rights group, remember this, European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, or ECCHR, and a UK law firm, the Public Interest Lawyers, or PIL, indicates hundreds of Iraqi people have been abused by the UK military as a matter of policy stemming from the chain of command. Now, in a statement following the ICC's announcement, the British government rejected the allegations of war crimes and indicated it is thoroughly investigating the charges, so the ICC jurisdiction is really unnecessary. Of course.
How convenient.
Everything's in control.
Right. Now, the reopening of the investigation represents a milestone for Iraqi victims and for international criminal law. Okay? Said the ECCHR General Secretary Wolfgang Kalek. Bennett says that it is far from certain that the ICC will press war crimes charges against top UK officials, but nonetheless, the possibility is hugely important. The UK is the only Western country that has faced a preliminary investigation by the ICC, which is a global body that the US has refused to participate in. The refusal of the U.S. to put itself under jurisdiction of international law is a huge impediment to the court's capacity to function as a global court. Said Bennis, "It's not the only example. We see this in decisions to go to war despite UN opposition, as well as blatant violations of international law and war crimes, including attacks on civilians, torture, imprisonment without trial, and assassinations." So I just think that this is certainly a step in the right direction, and I've asked this question. Just because the U.S. did not sign on to the criminal ICC court, just because they don't recognize its validity, I don't see any reason why they should not be prosecuted in absentia, even if it's a false prosecution that turns out to be nothing more than, I don't know what you would call it. Somebody would say, well, it's just, it doesn't have any weight. It may not have any weight, but I think it would certainly be valuable as a deterrent. And I think that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, you'll start hearing
Nobody's
about
ever
American
gonna have any justice.
exceptionalism, I guess.
Exactly. I just think that as a deterrent, people need to know that they can be subject to prosecution. I mean, if a criminal in the United States says, well, I'm sorry, you can't prosecute me because I don't recognize U.S. law, I'm sorry, he's ignored, okay?
Some people try it. Yes.
So, sorry, those are
Well,
two
that's
separate.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, and
Yeah.
I think didn't
Questions are-
someone just ask Mr. Blair about
Oh, yeah.
this, and he sort of chuckled and sort of passed it off as not important, which I think is just typical arrogance
Yeah.
of the Western
Well,
countries.
I think it's interesting. Democracy Now! Has been doing an interview with Richard Clarke, who actually, now here was something, he worked for the Clinton administration as the, what was his exact title? He was head of the intelligence.
He was called the terrorism czar.
Czar, something, they called him that. But the fact is, he resigned from his position when Bush said that they were going to go in and attack Iraq. He just, that was it. And he's written books on it. He has, been a consultant to the Obama administration. So far, though, he has come out and said he does believe that precedent was set with the International Criminal Court, that the precedent to prosecute leaders of nations for all the crimes that our leaders have been guilty about, intervention, war crimes, etc. Although so far his focus has only been on the Bush administration, Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld. Oh God, I'd like to throw Kissinger in there. But I'm waiting to see if there's anything said about our current administration. We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Okay, sorry I interrupted you, Deb. Any further questions or comments for Karen?
One comment on Karen's invocation of that remarkable snake, Richard Clarke.
I didn't mean to paint him as a hero, but still.
Yeah, as he was counterterrorism, as Ron said, counterterrorism czar in the White House.
Right.
He and his deputy, Rand Beers, both resigned, as you said, when when Iraq was invaded. But it's in protest of the policy. They thought the invasion was a mistake, but not because they were against killing Middle Easterners. They thought they were killing the wrong Middle Easterners.
Well,
they shouldn't be. They
true.
shouldn't be invading. They shouldn't be invading. The U.S. shouldn't be invading Iraq. It should be invading Iran. And the mistake they thought was going to be serious. Clarke made a bit of a name for himself in the 9/11 hearings, but I think he represents a different strain of neoconservatism in American politics in the last decade.
Yeah.
And we certainly should understand what those strains are, but I would be distressed if anyone thought he was a hero.
No, I didn't mean to give the impression he was a hero, but it is good to get the information that, at least there was some opposition to invading Iraq. I wasn't aware that he wanted to invade Iran. So that's...
Okay,
Sorry,
Deb,
go ahead,
sorry I
Deb.
interrupted you.
No, that's fine.
What do you have for us?
I'm going to do a piece of a speech that Dr. Cornel West made at the Left Forum from John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. The title of the reform itself was, was Reform or Revolution. And some of the speakers that were there were Angela Davis, David Harvey, and Harry Belafonte. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Cornell, West. He's an American philosopher, academic, activist, author, public intellectual, prominent member of the Democratic Socialists of America. He has taught at Harvard and Princeton and teaches now at the Union Theological Seminary. So I'm going to start off by quoting Mr. West. "We embrace the reformers, those who think to tinker. Well, okay, if you want to be incremental, fine. But just don't stop there. We are calling for fundamental transformation of American capital society, with its empire keeping track of a vicious legacy of white supremacy, male supremacy. We have no room for anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Arab hatred, anti-Muslim hatred, and we are keeping track of the present gay brothers, lesbian sisters, transgendered, and bisexual, but we are also focusing on the children. And I don't know about you, but I focus on the new Jim Crow, the vicious prison industrial complex, and its relation to the Wall Street oligarchy, plutocratic complex, with vicious crimes being committed. But not one Wall Street executive is going to jail, not one." Unquote. Cornell continues informing the audience that he teaches a class in prison to about 150 prisoners. 62% of them have been convicted of soft drug crimes, while the biggest criminals in the country are having tea at the White House. He mentions J.P. Morgan Chase, Mr. Jeremy Diamond.
Yeah, Jamie.
He also continues to pay homage to freedom fighters who have passed, such as Maya Angelou, Princeton Harding, Mary Barak, and Paul Sweezy. The main body of Mr. West's speech revolves around 4 questions that was asked by W.D. Du Bois when he was arrested when he was 89 years old, shackled after being investigated by the FBI. After years of trying to keep track of the dignity and decency of poor and working people, the wretched of the earth, he was asked, "What do you have to say?" And he invoked these 4 questions. And now I'm going to go back to what Mr. West had to say. Quote, "How does integrity face oppression? Willingness to critically vigorously from the vantage point of poor working people, to speak candidly, unintimidated, plain, frank speech in the face of the powers that be, and also to be willing to sacrifice your popularity. Sacrifice your mainstream executive. Sacrifice your establishmentarian affirmation in the name of something bigger than you, truth and justice. We attempt to be people of integrity in a moment of which an American empire is relatively a crime. Undeniably dictate. Look at the situation of our schools. Look at the souls of our children. Look at the condition of working people. Look at the ways of which women are being dehumanized, viciously attacked. Look at the way of which oligarchs and plutocrats have colonized the courts, White House, Congress. Look at those empirical tentacles. Keep track of those precious children in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, with U.S. drones dropping bombs on them, 224 children and counting. Every child has the same value. A child born in Newtown, Connecticut, or on the east side of Los Angeles, or in Tel Aviv, or in the West Bank, Ethiopia, Guatemala, anywhere in the world. We are supposed to be a people of integrity. Second question, what does honesty do in the face of deception? And we did it with organized forms of deception. A lie. White supremacy is. Male supremacy is. Homophobia is. Losing sight of humanity, of working people, and others is. Organized deception is intimately connected with arbitrary uses of power, especially from above. How do we become honest people? And when you talk about integrity and honesty, it cuts across ideology. We are not talking about an ism. We are talking about a certain kind of people, a certain group of people who are committed to something bigger than themselves, radically against the odds. The weapons of mass distraction shape our corporate multiplex when it comes to media. And that is why we love our sister Amy Goodman. She is willing to allow the voices to tell the truth, sheer honesty. Question number 3, what does decency do in the face of insult? We can add assault, we can add attack, we can add character assassination, and yes, some of us must be willing to die. There is no movement, change, fundamental change, revolution, unless there is a willingness on behalf of somebody to die. And that is especially when it comes to black, brown, and red people, especially when it comes to a vicious legacy of white supremacy. People trying to keep track of those who want to tell the truth, how to expose the lies, and try to bear witness in their own fallible way. We are not talking about self-righteousness. We are talking about a willingness to move forward in the face of darkness, trying to keep that flickering candle alive that highlights the plight of those who are rendered invisible. That's what we are talking about. Thank God for the Black Agenda Report. I saw Brother Bruce come through and so many others. We have to keep track of this vicious attempt to try to corporatize and marketize the internet so that we can follow the Negro national anthem of lifting every voice. No, they don't want the voices of those who are speaking from the vantage of poor and working people. They want echoes of those who reflect either the mean-spirited cold-heartedness of right-wing Republican Party policy or the milquetoast, spineless neoliberal policy of the Democratic Party. Both of them echo the oligarchy power, echoes the plutocratic party power, Don't want to tell the truth about the suffering beneath. The truth is not in the middle. The truth is beneath the lies of so much of our public discussion. But we are here because we are on fire. And we are on fire because too many of our fellow precious citizens are lukewarm. They are too callous and too indifferent. The plight of our schools being privatized, the vicious attacks of the trade union movement. They are too callous and indifferent when it comes to the oligarchs and plutocrats on Wall Street, the corporate elites who are getting away with financial murder. They are too callous and indifferent when it comes to the national security state and the surveillance expansion that Brother Edward Snowden, thank God for Brother Snowden, thank God for Chelsea Manning, and thank God for them, because they are not just whistleblowers, they are human beings who have decided to be persons of integrity, of honesty and decency. And the last question, how does virtue meet brute force? Brute force. You can't talk about change in America, reform, or revolution unless you come to terms with the FBI, the CIA, the police, the army, the cannons, and the cybertized weaponry. That is what we are up against, and that is why people come to us and say, oh, Brother West, you talk about revolution. You know America, even if it needs revolution, it only has the capacity for counter-revolution because the right-wing forces are so strong. For every soldier you have, 15 members are with the Ku Klux Klan. This is America, let's be honest. Our struggle is not confined to the United States. We have brothers and sisters in Latin America, brothers and sisters in Asia, brothers and sisters in Africa, Europe, and all around the world. This is a global affair. You have a global working class, a global capitalist economy, white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab hatred. This is a global phenomenon, not just in the United States.
Very good. Some stirring and eloquent words from Cornel West.
Yeah, he turns heads, and he's, a lot of people don't really care for his style, but he's brutally honest, and it does us all good to hear the truth, because we're certainly not going to get it from NBC.
Questions or comments for Deb?
Yeah. Well, I would just like to point out that the word revolution means change. It doesn't necessarily mean taking up arms to bring about change. And I think there's a problem that some people think that if there's going to be a revolution, it may mean violence and taking up arms. And I think that that's a real
Well,
mistake.
the real fact of the matter
I
is,
don't
you
think
know, if
that's
you
what
are
he
going to
means.
try to stand up for real change, you know, the powers that be are the ones that have all the power. So, you know, you see it in country after country after country, people trying to stand up for themselves, and they end up in the middle of violence to quell what they are trying, what they are fighting for.
But does that mean we have to take up arms against our government?
Well,
Is
no,
that
but
the
I'm
only way
saying
to
that
bring
it
about
could come
change?
to a place where we may have to defend ourselves from the powers.
Good luck on that one. With
yeah.
I mean, how many of us have drones in our
I hear
backyards?
you. I hear you.
My point is that if change were to start taking place a little sooner, first of all, what we need to do is pressure our governments and and point out to our people through education and information that we need to stop spending money on the arms proliferation. This would be the first step. I think that's a great idea. I would love to melt down all weapons and start putting it into
Sure is a good
you know
Right,
farm
tools.
tools, which in the future we may need to do because we're going to have such a lack of resources, a lack of food, a lack of
Right.
water. So I don't think we need to take up arms because I think the climate change and
Well, I don't
nuclear
think he's
proliferation-
suggesting that either.
That's my point.
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah,
point. Some
he's-
people
yeah.
out there will think that he is suggesting that we take up arms to fight our government. And I've never considered myself a total pacifist, but I am saying that that isn't necessarily what he means.
Yeah.
By revolution, it can mean many things,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things we're doing here now.
Okay, let's
right.
postpone the rest of that discussion and turn finally to Carl, who will give us some account of where he's
Actually,
been
I would
the
like
past
to
few weeks.
take at least part of what little time we have left to underline a point that Deb just made that I think pulls together some of the themes of tonight's discussion. As I understood, Deb, you wanted to suggest that revolutionary violence, if it's to be justified at all, has to be understood as defensive violence. That is, things that are done against an oppressive system which has initiated the violence,
Right.
even structural violence that of the sort Cornel West was talking about. I'm reminded of a article from James Connolly, the Irish politically labor leader at the time of the First World War, when he was writing about conscription in Ireland to fight Britain's war. And he wrote that one great source of the strength of the ruling class has ever been its willingness to kill. Let its power once be challenged by domestic revolutionaries or foreigners, it is willing to kill and kill and kill. It is in striking contrast to the reluctance of all true revolutionaries to shed blood. This is an important point. I mean, we're not surely in this country at the point of violent revolution right now, but there are violent revolutions around the world, and the occasion for the violent revolutions is principally the policies of the American government. And I'll connect that with my recent sojourn in Beijing with the observation that I heard 3 shocking things while I was in Beijing, and all of them came from Americans. The first was from the Pentagon. While I was sitting at breakfast in Beijing, I was reading the Wall Street Journal say that the current phrase in the Pentagon that was being much bandied about that week when the agreement between Russia and China that Karen was talking about was signed. The current phrase in the Pentagon was offshore control. And that's one of those Pentagonian euphemisms. Offshore control in Pentagonese means denying oil imports into China.
Right.
Now, in this program, in Aware on the Air, in the years that we've been on the air, we have stressed the fact that the Bush-Obama wars of the last decade have been wars about oil. not wars for oil in the sense that the U.S. was out securing its access to oil. The U.S., that's not an issue. There were wars for oil in that they were wars for control of world oil flows. Since the Second World War, the U.S. has been dedicated to the foreign policy principles that if it controls world energy flows, it controls the economies of its principal rivals in Asia and in Europe. This is the goal of American policy, to keep that world economic control, which after all is not much to the interest of most Americans, but is very much to the interest of the 1%. The U.S. military and foreign policy is to keep that control, and the best way to do it is to control the flows of energy. So while I'm sitting in Beijing reading about the Russian-Chinese agreements on energy, what I'm really hearing is the great fear in Washington that the U.S. control is slipping away. Now, the way this is expressed in Washington is the U.S. is going to isolate China and Russia. And at this point, things get even funny. The notion of the U.S. isolating Russia and China, look at a map and say that there might be some difficulties here. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that that is indeed the Obama administration's, that's what the Obama administration is doing from Ukraine to Japan. And it is this offshore control, that is controls precisely of energy imports, that the U.S. is concerned about, and indeed it's counter to the Russian-Chinese agreement. The lights are burning late and foggy bottom on these issues, and the policy should be obvious to us all. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases around the world in more than 130 countries. Russia has none. China has none. Depending upon what you want to say about Ukraine and Tibet, there are no examples of the sort of overseas military control that the U.S. is exercising on the part of either Russia or China. Now, in this circumstance, what is the cause, or what is the threat of war to the world? The threat of war to the world is the policy of the United States government, which has only war to continue its economic domination. And it's shown for the last several years, of course, that it's perfectly willing to use it. Makes no difference what party is in charge in Washington, because of course it's always the same party, the neoliberal party.
Yeah, and the constant indifference to international law, which I want to just quickly mention. There's an article, Stop the War Coalition. It came out in May. And I can't see the name of it, but I don't mean to interrupt you, Carl, but maybe next week I'll focus on this. But yeah, I mean, we're really very arrogant, and when it comes to international law, we just shrug it off, and we expect other countries to actually live by that, and yet we just totally ignore it.
Okay, we must close down. Our time is almost up. This is Aware on the Air, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, coming to you every week. We will be demonstrating downtown in Champaign Saturday afternoon, 2 to 4, and showing up at the farmers market in Urbana on several Saturday mornings in the near future. This is Tuesday, June 3rd, 2014, and with that we'll have to close down. So good night from us, from Carl, Karen, Janet, myself, and Deb, and we hope you will think about these matters, and good night to you.